The sound of maple wood snapping against cold stone is not loud. But on a frozen Tuesday morning at Blackwood Military Academy, it sounded like a gunshot. 300 cadets stood frozen in formation, forced to watch as Colonel Richard Thorne destroyed the only thing his son, Leo, had left of his dead mother. Thorne didn't just break the violin. He looked at his 14-year-old boy with eyes colder than the winter frost and said the words that no child can ever unhear. "I would rather bury a dead son than raise a weak one." Leo didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply died inside, right there on the pavement. But the colonel made a mistake that morning. He thought he was the most powerful man in the courtyard. He didn't notice the maintenance man standing in the shadows, a mute, scarred janitor named Elias, who everyone ignored, who everyone treated like part of the scenery. Thorne saw a janitor. He saw trash. He didn't know that the man gripping that push broom had hands that were once insured for $1 million. He didn't know that the trash he was sneering at was the only reason the Thorne family name still existed. And as the colonel marched his broken son away to solitary confinement, he had no idea that he had just started a war. Not a war of guns, but a war of silence. And the man he underestimated was about to teach him that the loudest sound in the world isn't an order. It's the truth coming from the grave. The morning air at Blackwood Military Academy was always cold, but today it felt brittle, as if the sky itself might shatter. 300 cadets stood in perfect formation on the concrete quadrangle, their breath rising in synchronized white puffs. They were statues in gray wool, eyes fixed on the horizon, terrified to blink. Colonel Richard Thorne paced the front of the line. He walked with the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots that had seen foreign soil, a sound that usually commanded respect. Today, however, he carried something that looked pathetically fragile in his leather-gloved grip. A violin. The wood was aged, the varnish chipped in places, a relic of a softer world that had no place within these iron gates. He stopped in front of a boy who looked too small for his uniform. Leo Thorne, 14 years old, stared at the center of his father's chest. He did not look up. He hadn't looked up since the funeral 3 years ago, and he hadn't spoken a word since the earth had covered his mother's casket. "I found this under your bunk," the colonel said. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low, grinding gravel that carried further than any shout. "We are training men here, Leo. Not minstrels, not weeping poets." Leo didn't move. His hands were pinned to his sides, thumbs aligned with the seams of his trousers, just as the manual required. But his eyes, usually deadened and distant, were wide. They were fixed on the instrument in his father's hand with a desperation that looked painful. "Your mother is gone," Thorne said, and the cruelty of the statement was in its flat, factual delivery. "Clinging to her hobbies will not bring her back. It only makes you weak. And I will not have a weak son." Thorne raised the violin high. For a second, it hung suspended against the gray morning sky, a beautiful curve of maple and spruce. Then he brought it down. He didn't just drop it. He drove it into the corner of the stone commemorative plinth. The sound of the wood snapping was sickeningly human. It sounded like a bone breaking. The strings groaned as the tension released, a discordant, dying whine that echoed off the brick barracks. The bridge collapsed, and the neck sheared away from the body, leaving a mess of splinters on the frost-covered ground. A ripple of tension went through the ranks of cadets, a collective flinch they tried to suppress. But Leo didn't flinch. He just stopped breathing. The color drained from his face until he looked like a ghost haunting his own body. He opened his mouth, And for a terrifying second, it looked like he might finally scream, might finally break the vow of silence he'd kept for 3 years. But no sound came out. His throat worked convulsively, but the scream died before it could be born. He simply collapsed inward, his shoulders slumping as the invisible strings holding him upright were cut. Detention. The storage block. Until you remember who you are, Thorne ordered, tossing the broken neck of the violin onto the pile of debris. He turned his back on his son. Dismissed. The formation broke with mechanical precision, boots hammering the pavement as the cadets marched away, leaving Leo alone with the wreckage. 20 yards away, near the edge of the mess hall, Elias pushed a heavy push broom across the asphalt. He wore the dark green jumpsuit of the maintenance staff, a cap pulled low over his forehead. Most people at Blackwood didn't look at Elias. If they did, they looked away quickly. The left side of his face was a map of ruined flesh, a thick, burn-like scar that pulled his lip into a permanent grimace and vanished down the collar of his shirt. Elias couldn't speak. A piece of shrapnel had taken his voice box 2 decades ago in a desert halfway across the world. But his hearing was sharp, sharpened by years of living in a world of silence. He had watched the entire scene. He hadn't stopped sweeping, the rhythmic shh of the bristles masking his attention. But his grip on the wooden handle was so tight, his knuckles were white. He looked at the debris on the ground, the shattered wood that had been a voice for a boy who couldn't speak. Elias knew that look in Leo's eyes. He had seen it on young soldiers before the light went out of them forever. It wasn't just sadness. It was the total amputation of the soul. As the boy was marched away by a stern-faced instructor toward the isolation block, Elias slowly pushed his broom toward the stone plinth. He waited until the courtyard was empty. Then he knelt. His large, calloused hands, rough as sandpaper, hovered over the broken violin. He picked up a piece of the bridge, then a tuning peg. He gathered the splinters with a tenderness that seemed impossible for a man of his size. He didn't throw them in the trash bin strapped to his cart. Instead, he pulled a grimy handkerchief from his pocket, wrapped the broken pieces of wood carefully inside, and tucked the bundle deep into the inner pocket of his coat, right against his heart. He looked toward the dark, narrow windows of the detention block. Elias knew about silence. He knew that when you take away a man's voice, the scream doesn't disappear. It just goes deeper, down where it starts to burn. And looking at the solitary window where the boy was now trapped, Elias decided that the burning had to stop. The detention block at Blackwood was known among the cadets as the Icebox, a nickname earned not just for its lack of heating, but for the absolute suffocating isolation it imposed. It was a renovated storage closet on the ground floor, smelling faintly of bleach and old rubber mats. There were no windows, only a heavy steel door with a narrow viewing slit that remained firmly shut. Leo sat on the floor, his back pressed against the cinder block wall. He had stopped shivering hours ago. The cold had seeped past his skin and settled into his marrow, a dull ache that felt strangely appropriate. In the darkness, time became a liquid concept, dissolving into nothingness. He wasn't thinking about the future or the military career his father had mapped out for him like a battle strategy. He was thinking about the silence. For 3 years, silence had been his fortress. It was safe. Words were dangerous. Words could be rejected, mocked, or ignored. But if you said nothing, no one could hurt you. Yet, as he sat there hugging his knees, the image of the violin shattering against the stone plinth played on a loop in his mind. That snap of wood was the loudest sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of the last tether to his mother snapping. He closed his eyes, waiting for sleep or morning, unable to tell which would come first. That was when the vibration started. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a tremor running through the floorboards, a subtle hum that tickled the soles of his boots. Leo frowned, pressing his ear against the cold concrete. It grew distinct, separating itself from the groan of the settling building and the distant wind outside. It was a melody, but it wasn't the kind of music the Academy played on dress parade days. It wasn't the rigid, brassy march of victory. This was thin, reedy, and haunting. It sounded like something crying in a language that had been forgotten. Curiosity, a sensation Leo thought his father had successfully drilled out of him, sparked in his chest. He crawled toward the far corner of the room where a ventilation grate sat loose in its frame. The screws had rusted away years ago. With a gentle tug, the metal grate gave way. The shaft behind it was narrow, smelling of coal dust and damp earth, but it was large enough for a 14-year-old boy who had stopped eating properly months ago. Leo didn't decide to move. His body simply obeyed the pull of the music. He slid into the darkness, crawling through the dust, following the sorrowful song down into the belly of the school. The tunnel sloped downward, the air growing warmer and thicker with every yard. The music grew louder, transforming from a hum into a clear, piercing cry. It was a violin, but it sounded wrong. Rougher, deeper, with a metallic rasp that caught in the throat. Leo emerged into a service crawlspace that looked down into the main boiler room. It was a cavernous, red-lit chamber dominated by the massive iron furnace that heated the entire academy. The fire inside the grate roared and hissed, casting long, dancing shadows against the brick walls, and there, sitting on an overturned milk crate in front of the open furnace door, was the janitor. Elias looked terrifying in the firelight. The scar on his face seemed to writhe as the flames licked the air, twisting his features into something that looked half-melted. He was stripped down to his undershirt, revealing arms that were thick with muscle and mapped with smaller, paler scars. But Leo didn't look at the scars. He looked at what was in Elias's hands. It was an abomination of an instrument. The body was a rectangular cigar box, sanded down to the raw wood. The neck appeared to be carved from a table leg, bolted crudely onto the body. The strings weren't catgut or silver-wound steel. They were dull gray wire, perhaps unraveled from a bike brake or a snare trap. It was ugly, makeshift, and jagged. Yet, as Elias drew the bow across those wires, the sound that emerged was pure, unadulterated grief. Elias played with his eyes closed, his heavy body swaying slightly. He wasn't playing a classical etude. He was improvising, tearing notes from the air that spoke of deserts, of burning heat, of loss so profound it had no bottom. The wires bit into his calloused fingertips, but he didn't seem to feel it. Leo watched, mesmerized. He had grown up believing that music required pristine instruments, expensive lessons, and perfect posture. His father had taught him that quality was something you bought. But here, in the bowels of the earth, a man who couldn't speak was creating a symphony out of trash. Elias hit a high note, a long, sustaining wail that mimicked the sound of a human voice crying out. It was so raw, so nakedly painful, that Leo forgot to breathe. He leaned forward, his hand slipping on the metal grating. Clang! The sound was sharp and immediate. The music stopped instantly. Elias was on his feet in a blur of motion, the bow held like a knife, his body coiled to strike. His eyes, wide and alert, snapped up to the crawl space. The firelight caught the whites of his eyes, making him look wild. Leo froze. He knew he should run. He knew the penalty for being out of detention was severe, but he couldn't move. He was pinned by the intensity of the janitor's gaze. Elias stared at the boy, peering down from the darkness. The tension in the room was physical, a taut wire ready to snap. The janitor's chest heaved, sweat glistening on his scarred skin. He saw the cadet uniform, the small, frightened face of the colonel's son. But Elias didn't shout. He couldn't, and he didn't raise the alarm. Slowly, the aggression drained from Elias's stance. He lowered the bow. He looked at the makeshift violin in his hand, then back up at Leo. The scar on his lip twitched, not in a snarl, but in something that might have been a question. He raised a hand and beckoned, one finger curling inward. "Come down." Leo hesitated. Every rule in his head screamed no. This man was a stranger, a subordinate, a grunt, as his father called the support staff. But the memory of the music was stronger than the fear. That sound had touched the place in Leo's chest that had been empty since his mother died. Leo pushed the grate fully open and swung his legs down onto the ladder. He climbed down into the heat, into the roar of the furnace, leaving the cold, silent world of the academy behind him. When his boots hit the concrete floor, he stood only a few feet from the large man. Up close, Elias smelled of old smoke and peppermint soap. He towered over the boy. He gestured to the milk crate, then pointed to the instrument. Leo stepped forward. He reached out, his fingers trembling, and touched the rough wood of the cigar box. It was warm from the fire. Elias watched him, his dark eyes softening. He tapped his own chest, right over his heart, then pointed at Leo. It was a simple gesture, but in the roaring silence of the boiler room, its meaning was louder than any spoken word. "I know where you are hurting, because I am hurting there too." The Courier cigar box violin felt alien in Leo's hands. It lacked the smooth, lacquered finish of the Italian instrument his father had destroyed. It was rough, unfinished, and heavy with the density of repurposed oak. When Leo tried to tuck it under his chin, the wood scraped against his skin, a tactile reminder that this object was not a toy. It was a tool of survival. He raised the bow, his elbow instinctively lifting into the rigid, perfect angle his expensive tutors had drilled into him for years. Elias stepped forward. He didn't push the boy's arm down. Instead, he reached out and placed a large, warm hand on Leo's shoulder. The weight of it was grounding. He squeezed gently once, twice. "Relax." Leo let his breath out. He hadn't realized he was holding it. His shoulders dropped. The military stiffness, the armor he wore to survive the academy, melted away, leaving just a boy standing in his socks on a concrete floor. Elias moved behind him, adjusting Leo's grip on the bow. His own hands were a landscape of trauma. The knuckles were swollen, the skin mapped with white lines of old lacerations, and the fingernails were permanently stained with grease. But his touch was incredibly delicate. He guided Leo's fingers not to grip the bow, but to balance it. He was teaching the boy that control didn't come from force. It came from surrender. Leo drew the bow across the wire strings. The sound was thin at first, hesitant, but Elias nodded, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. Good. Again. For the next hour, there were no words. There was only the hum of the furnace and the scrape of rosin on wire. They communicated in a language older than speech. The tilt of a head, the tapping of a foot, the shared intake of breath before a crescendo. In this underground chamber, Leo wasn't the disappointment of the Thorne legacy. He was just a vessel for the sound. A heavy metallic groan interrupted them. The iron door to the boiler room creaked open, spilling a wedge of artificial hallway light into their sanctuary. Leo froze, terrified. He clutched the makeshift violin to his chest, expecting his father's silhouette, expecting the shouting, the punishment. But it wasn't the colonel. A short, round woman bustled in, carrying a plastic Tupperware container and a thermos. It was Mrs. Martha, the head cook. She had worked at Blackwood longer than the colonel had been in charge, a fixture of the institution who smelled permanently of yeast and vanilla. She didn't look surprised to see a cadet hiding in the boiler room. She simply closed the door with her hip, sealing them back in the warmth. "I figured you'd have company tonight, Elias," she said, her voice a soft, raspy alto that echoed comfortably off the brick walls. She set the food down on a workbench covered in tools. "And I figured that company would be starving. The colonel cut the boys' rations. I heard the order go down to the kitchen myself." She opened the container. Steam rose, up, carrying the rich, savory scent of beef stew. Real stew, not the watery slop served in the mess hall. "Eat," Martha commanded, handing Leo a spoon. "You can't play if your hands are shaking from hunger." Leo looked at Elias. The janitor nodded, moving to sit on an upturned bucket. He took the thermos Martha offered him, his expression softening into something like gratitude. Leo took a bite. The warmth of the food hit his stomach like a shock wave, reminding him of how empty he had been. He ate quickly, the spoon scraping against the plastic. Martha watched him, her arms crossed over her apron, her eyes sad and knowing. "He's a good teacher, isn't he?" she asked Leo quietly. Leo nodded, his mouth full. Martha looked at Elias, who was staring into the fire, lost in his own thoughts. "People up there." She jerked her head toward the ceiling, toward the sleeping barracks in the colonel's quarters. "They look at him, and they see a janitor. They see the scars. They see a mute man pushing a broom." She stepped closer to Leo, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper, though Elias surely could hear her. "But you look at his hands, child. You look at those fingers." Leo looked. Elias was turning the thermos in his hands, his movements precise and rhythmic. "Those aren't the hands of a man who was born holding a broom," Martha said, her voice thick with a history Leo didn't understand yet. "Those are hands that have stitched flesh and saved lives. Those are hands that held men together when the world was blowing apart." Elias looked up then, his eyes sharp. He shook his head once, a quick, hard motion. "Enough." Martha sighed, backing down. All right. No history lessons tonight, just music." She reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from Leo's forehead, a touch of motherly affection that felt startling in this harsh place. "You stay here as long as you need, Leo. The night watchman is asleep in the guard shack. I put a little extra turkey in his sandwich." She winked, then turned to leave. "Elias, keep him safe, and keep that music down. The pipes carry sound better than you think." When the door clicked shut, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was companionable. Elias stood up. He didn't pick up the violin immediately. Instead, he walked over to the wall where he had sketched a music staff in charcoal on the brick. He pointed to a note, then pointed to his ear. He made a gesture, a flat palm moving horizontally through the air. Legato, smooth, connected. He handed the instrument back to Leo. They played until the furnace timer clicked over to the morning cycle. In those hours, Leo didn't just learn how to play a cigar box violin. He learned that he wasn't alone in the dark. He learned that broken things could still make beautiful sounds if you knew how to hold them. And for the first time in 3 years, as he snuck back up the ventilation shaft to the cold misery of his detention cell, Leo wasn't thinking about the silence. He was hearing a melody in his head, loud and defiant, drowning out the fear of the morning inspection. For 7 days, the boiler room was the only place in the world that made sense. Leo had developed a routine. He would endure the crushing boredom of the detention cell by day, counting the cinder blocks, rehearsing finger positions on his forearm. And when the academy lights flickered out at 1000 hours, he would slide the grate aside and descend into the warmth. He was getting better. The cigar box violin, with its wire strings and rough neck, had a voice that was darkening, deepening. It no longer sounded like a toy. It sounded like a wounded animal learning to howl. Elias had taught him how to lean into the bow, how to use the weight of his own arm to pull a sound that lingered in the air long after the motion stopped. Tonight, the lesson was about intensity. Elias stood by the furnace, his arms folded across his chest, his head nodding in time with Leo's movements. Leo was playing a variation of a folk song his mother used to hum. A simple, melancholic tune that felt right in this underground cathedral of piping and steam. The music swirled around them, bouncing off the red brick walls, creating a cocoon of safety. Leo closed his eyes, losing himself in the vibration of the wood against his jaw. He felt, for the first time in years, a sensation that was dangerously close to joy. He didn't hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the metal gantry above. He didn't hear the grate in the detention cell being kicked aside. The only warning they got was the groan of the boiler room's main hydraulic door. It didn't open with the gentle nudge of Mrs. Martha. It was thrown open with a violence that shook the dust from the overhead pipes. The cold air from the hallway rushed in, instantly killing the warmth of the room. Leo stopped mid-bow. The wire screeched, a hideous, jarring noise that cut through the sudden silence. Colonel Thorne stood in the doorway. He was fully dressed in his service dress uniform, the ribbons on his chest gleaming under the harsh hallway lights. He looked like a statue carved from ice and judgment. His eyes swept the room, taking in the scene with a terrifying clinical detachment. The makeshift furniture, the remnants of shared food, the scarred janitor, and finally his son, holding a piece of garbage like it was a holy relic. Thorne stepped into the room. The air seemed to leave with him, sucked out by the sheer gravity of his anger. "I thought," Thorne said, his voice terrifyingly calm, "that I had made myself clear." Leo lowered the instrument. His hands began to shake, the tremors starting in his fingers and racing up to his shoulders. He stepped back, instinctively moving closer to Elias. Thorne saw the movement. His eyes narrowed, focusing on the janitor. He didn't see a mentor. He didn't see a man who had kept his son fed and sane. He saw contamination. He saw a deformed, mute laborer infecting his bloodline with weakness. "You." Thorne spat the word at Elias. He walked forward, closing the distance between them. Elias didn't retreat. He stood his ground, his posture straightening, his chin lifting. For a moment, the janitor looked more like a soldier than the colonel. "I entrusted the security of this facility to you," Thorne said, stopping inches from Elias's face. "I gave you a job when no one else would look at that face of yours. And this is how you repay me? By dragging my son down into the filth with you?" Elias's jaw tightened. His hands balled into fists at his sides, the tendons standing out like steel cables. He looked at Thorne, and his eyes burned with a fire that should have warned the colonel to back away. But Thorne was blind to anything but his own rigid code. Thorne turned to Leo. He reached out and snatched the cigar box violin from the boy's hands. He examined it for a second, a sneer curling his lip, before tossing it into the open maw of the furnace. Leo lunged forward, a silent cry forming in his throat, but Elias caught him. The janitor's arm was a steel bar across Leo's chest, holding him back, keeping him safe. They both watched as the dry wood caught fire instantly, the wire strings glowing orange before snapping in the heat. "Get your things," Thorne said to Elias, not looking at him. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. If you are on this property in 1 hour, I will have the military police remove you by force." Elias looked at the fire, then at Leo. The boy was trembling violently against him. Elias placed a hand on Leo's head, a final, gentle pressure, before stepping away. He didn't beg. He didn't write a note pleading for his job. He simply nodded to the boy, a silent message of endurance, and walked toward his locker to retrieve his coat. "And you?" Thorne grabbed Leo by the shoulder, his grip bruising. He spun the boy around, forcing him to march toward the door. "You have proven that you lack the discipline for Blackwood. You need something stronger." Thorne dragged his son out of the boiler room, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Tomorrow morning, you are shipping out to Fort Benning's youth correctional program. If they can't break this sickness out of you, Leo, then you are no son of mine." Leo stumbled as he was pulled into the hallway, his feet dragging on the floor. He looked back over his shoulder, desperate for one last glimpse of his friend. Elias was standing alone in the center of the room, bathed in the red glow of the furnace. He wasn't packing his bag. He was watching Leo. And as the heavy iron door slammed shut, separating them, Elias brought his hand to his forehead in a slow, sharp salute. The lock clicked. The silence returned. But this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a war that had just begun. Colonel Thorne's office was a shrine to order. The mahogany desk was polished to a mirror shine. The books on the shelves were aligned by height, and the American flag in the corner stood motionless, draped in heavy, silent folds. It was the antithesis of the chaotic, dirty warmth of the boiler room he had just raided. Thorne sat behind his desk, a tumbler of amber whiskey untouched near his right hand. He was filling out the termination paperwork for the maintenance staff member, Elias Vance. Cause: gross misconduct, insubordination. He pressed the pen hard into the paper, carving the letters deep as if the ink alone wasn't enough to excise the man from his world. He told himself he was doing the right thing. Leo was soft. The boy needed iron, not art. The boy needed to survive in a world that chewed up the weak, and Thorne was the only one strong enough to harden him. The heavy oak door to his office didn't knock. It simply opened. Thorne looked up, his brow furrowing. "I gave orders not to be disturbed, Sergeant." But it wasn't the sergeant on duty. It was Mrs. Martha. She was still wearing her flour-dusted apron, looking absurdly out of place against the leather and wood of the command center. But her face held none of the usual kitchen warmth. Her jaw was set, and her eyes were hard, flinty things. She walked straight to the desk, ignoring the colonel's rank, ignoring the unspoken boundary that separated the help from the administration. "Martha," Thorne said, his voice clipped, "I am in the middle of a disciplinary matter. If this is about the menu for tomorrow—" "It is about the menu," Martha interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. "It's about what you're serving your son. Poison." Thorne stood up slowly, using his height to intimidate. "You are crossing a line, Mrs. Martha. I suggest you return to the mess hall before I add your name to the termination list." Martha didn't flinch. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. She tossed it onto the pristine surface of the desk. It landed with a heavy, metallic thud that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. "You threw a man out in the snow tonight," Martha said. "You called him filth, You looked at his face and you saw a monster? I saw a liability, Thorne corrected cold. Open it, she commanded. Thorne stared at the pouch. It was old, stained with oil, and what looked like dried blood. Against his better judgment, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, he reached out and undid the leather tie. He tipped the contents onto his desk. 2 objects fell out. The first was a photograph, black and white, creased down the middle. It showed a platoon of soldiers standing in front of a dust-covered Humvee. They were young, grinning, invincible. In the center, with his arm draped around a much older, stern-looking officer, was a young man. He was handsome, with a clear, strong jawline and eyes that sparkled with life. Thorne's breath hitched. He knew the older officer. It was his own father, General Marcus Thorne, taken during the final months of his command in the Gulf. You recognize the general, Martha said softly. Now look at the boy holding him up. Thorne looked. He traced the features of the laughing young soldier, the shape of the eyes, the brow. It was impossible, and yet undeniable. It was Elias. Before the scars, before the silence. The second object on the desk was a medal. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration a soldier could receive. But it was ruined. The ribbon was burned away, and the metal star was scorched black, warped by intense heat. Operation Desert Shield, Martha recited, her voice taking on the cadence of a prayer. February 26th. Extraction helicopter went down in a hot zone. Your father was trapped in the wreckage, unconscious. The fuel line ruptured. Thorne went still. He knew this story. Every Thorne knew this story. It was the family legend. The general had been pulled from the fire by a nameless medic who vanished into the medical system afterwards. His father had searched for that man until the day he died. The medic didn't vanish, Martha said, reading the realization on Thorne's face. He spent 2 years in a burn unit in Germany. He lost 40% of his skin, and he lost his voice screaming into a radio, calling in coordinates for the medevac while the fire cooked the vocal cords right out of his throat. He refused to leave your father's side until the extraction team landed. Thorne looked down at the paperwork under his hand. The name Elias Vance seemed to pulse on the page. He came here 5 years ago, Martha continued, tears finally welling in her eyes, though her voice remained fierce. He didn't want a parade. He didn't want your gratitude. He just wanted a quiet place to work, to be useful, to hide a face that scares children. He wanted peace, Richard. And tonight, you looked at the man who gave you your father back, the man who paid for your family's legacy with his own voice, and you treated him like garbage. Thorne sank back into his chair. The leather creaked, the sound impossibly loud. The room seemed to tilt. The image of the dirty janitor in the boiler room collided violently with the image of the hero in the photograph. The violin, the awkward, gentle way Elias had stood in front of Leo, protecting him. I will not have a weak son, Thorne had said. Yet the strongest man Thorne had ever unknowingly met had been sweeping his floors, teaching his son that strength wasn't about shouting orders. It was about enduring the fire. Thorne looked at the burnt metal. His hand trembled as he reached for the whiskey glass. But he didn't drink. He couldn't. The taste would be too bitter. He's packing his things in the bunkhouse, Martha said, turning to the door. She didn't slam it this time. She opened it quietly, leaving him with the wreckage of his own arrogance. If you let him walk out that gate, Colonel, you are the one who has failed. Not Leo, you. The door clicked shut. Thorne sat alone in the silence of his office. But for the first time in his life, the silence didn't feel like order. It felt like an accusation. He looked at the termination paper, then at the photo of his father, alive and safe in the arms of the man he had just destroyed. Slowly, Colonel Thorne picked up the pen. He didn't sign the paper. He drove the pen through the sheet, tearing it in half. Then he stood up, grabbed his cover, and walked out of the office, moving not with the heavy thud of a commander, but with the urgent, desperate stride of a man running out of time. The transport van idling at the academy gates was painted the same slate gray as the sky. Its exhaust pipe coughed white smoke into the freezing morning air, a rhythmic chugging that sounded like a dying lung. Leo stood at the bottom of the metal steps, his duffel bag heavy on his shoulder. He looked small against the backdrop of the waiting vehicle, a boy being shipped off to a place designed to sand away the edges of his personality until he was smooth, uniform, and silent. The entire cadet corps had been assembled to watch. It was part of the colonel's discipline. Witness the cost of failure. 300 boys stood at attention, their faces blank masks, though many of them shifted their weight uncomfortably. They knew Leo. They knew he wasn't a criminal. He was just different, and at Blackwood, difference was a defect. Colonel Thorne stood by the hood of the van. He looked older this morning. The lines around his mouth were etched deep, and his eyes, usually scanning the horizon for imperfections, were fixed on the asphalt. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night staring at a burnt metal and a black and white photograph, wrestling with a ghost that had suddenly put on flesh and blood. He should have stopped this. He knew that. But momentum is a terrible force. The orders had been cut, the transport arranged, the lesson prepared. Thorne was a man who knew how to start wars, not how to stop them. He stood paralyzed by his own rigidity, waiting for something, anything, to derail the train he had set in motion. "Board the vehicle, cadet," the transport driver said, checking his watch. "We're on a schedule." Leo didn't look at his father. He didn't look at the school that had been his prison. He gripped the strap of his bag, his knuckles white, and placed one foot on the metal step. He accepted his fate. The music was gone. The violin was ash. The janitor was gone. There was nothing left to fight for. Then the air changed. It started with a sharp electronic screech, feedback tearing through the high-powered loudspeakers mounted on the academy's clock tower. The cadets flinched, hands flying to their ears. The driver cursed, looking up at the pylon. But the screech settled instantly into a hum, and then a note. It wasn't a bugle call. It wasn't the morning anthem. It was a violin. The sound poured out of the speakers, amplified to a volume that shook the frost off the trees. It wasn't the scratchy, wire-thin sound of the cigar box Leo had played in the basement. This was rich, full-throated, and commanding. It was a master's instrument, played by a master's hand. Leo froze on the step. His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew that vibrato. He knew the way the bow bit into the string before releasing it into a soar. High above them, in the glass-enclosed communications booth that overlooked the quad, a figure stood silhouetted against the pale sun. Elias Vance had not left the grounds. He had broken into the one place where his voice could finally be heard. He was playing an old violin taken from the Academy's trophy case, an antique that had sat silent for 50 years, and he was making it weep. He played the Ashokan Farewell. It was a soldier's lament, a melody of devastating beauty that spoke of leaving, of losing, and of the love that remains when the battles are over. The music cascaded down over the formation, It washed over the gray uniforms, softening the hard lines of the military architecture. Cadets who had been trained to be stone statues began to look up. Some had tears in their eyes before they even realized they were crying. The transport driver looked confused. "What the hell is this? Turn that off." "No," a voice said. It wasn't the driver. It wasn't the colonel. Leo dropped his duffel bag. It hit the pavement with a soft thud. He turned around, stepping away from the van, away from the future his father had designed for him. He looked directly at Colonel Thorne. Thorne was staring up at the tower, his expression shattered. He wasn't angry. He looked like a man who was finally hearing a language he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. Leo took a step toward his father. The silence in his throat, the dam he had built to hold back the pain of his mother's death, began to crack. The music from the tower was the hammer striking the wall. "Dad," Leo said. The word was rusted, scratching his throat like sandpaper. It was barely a whisper, but in the hush that had fallen over the quad, it carried like a shout. Thorne's head snapped down. He looked at his son, really looked at him, for the first time in 3 years. He saw the tears streaming down Leo's face, not of weakness, but of release. "It's not noise," Leo said, his voice gaining strength, cracking on the vowels but pushing through. He pointed a shaking finger toward the tower, toward the scarred man pouring his soul into the microphone. "That isn't noise. That's how Mom used to say goodnight." The mention of her name, spoken aloud in the sterile air of Blackwood, broke the last of Thorne's defenses. The colonel looked from his son to the tower, where the man who had saved his father was now saving his son. The music swelled to a crescendo, high, piercing note that demanded to be felt. Thorne didn't yell for the guards. He didn't order the music stopped. Instead, he slowly uncurled his gloved fists. He looked at the transport driver, who was reaching for his radio. "Leave it," Thorne ordered, his voice thick with emotion. "Sir?" "I said leave it." Thorne turned his back on the van. He walked toward Leo, closing the distance between the commander and the cadet, until he was just a father standing in front of his boy. "Leo," Thorne whispered. Leo didn't salute. He didn't stand at attention. He simply wept, the sound mixing with the violin's melody, a harmony of grief and healing that finally, after 3 long years, was allowed to exist in the daylight. Thorne reached out. He didn't grab Leo's shoulder to discipline him. He placed a hand on the boy's head, clumsy and hesitant, brushing the hair back from his forehead. "I hear it," Thorne said, his voice breaking. "I hear it, son." Up in the tower, Elias watched them. He didn't stop playing. He finished the phrase, letting the final note hang in the air, vibrating through the bones of every person in the quad, proving that while a soldier can lose his voice, he never loses his song. The door to the communications booth opened. It wasn't kicked in. The latch simply clicked and swung inward. Elias lowered the antique violin. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavy, amplified by the sudden absence of the melody that had just filled the valley. He placed the instrument gently on the console table, next to the microphone that was still humming with residual energy. He didn't run. He didn't raise his hands. He simply turned to face the door, waiting for the consequences he had accepted the moment he broke the lock. Colonel Thorne filled the doorway. He was breathing hard, not from the climb up the tower stairs, but from the crushing weight of the realization that had brought him there. For a long moment, the 2 men just looked at the other, the janitor and the commander, the scarred outcast and the decorated leader. Thorne stepped into the small, glass-walled room. He looked at the violin, then at Elias's hands. those ruined, miraculous hands. He saw the burn scars that disappeared up Elias's sleeves, the physical map of a sacrifice made 20 years ago in a desert Thorne had only read about in after-action reports. "Mrs. Martha told me," Thorne said. His voice was quiet, stripped of all its usual bark and command. "She told me about the radio, about the fire." Elias watched him, his expression guarded. He brought a hand up to his throat, tracing the thick scar tissue there, and gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "Old news." "It's not old news to me," Thorne said, his voice thickening. He took a step closer, invading Elias's personal space, but there was no aggression in the posture. "My father, he spoke about you until the dementia took his mind. He used to say that angels don't have wings, they have radios. He spent 10 years looking for the voice that saved him." Thorne looked down at his own hands, the leather gloves creaking as he clenched them. "And I spent the last 3 years trying to silence the only beautiful thing left in my own son's life." Leo appeared in the doorway behind his father. He was out of breath, his face flushed, eyes wide with the fear that his father had come up here to hurt his friend. But he stopped when he saw his father's posture. The colonel's shoulders, usually squared and rigid, were slumped in a curve of profound humility. Thorne reached into his uniform pocket. He pulled out the scorched, blackened metal star, the Distinguished Service Cross he had kept on his desk. He placed it on the console table next to the violin. "I can't give you back your voice, Sergeant Vance," Thorne whispered. "And I can't give you back the years you spent hiding in my boiler room." Thorne straightened up. He adjusted his cover, squared his jaw, and snapped his heels together. It was a sound that echoed sharply in the small room. Slowly, with a precision that was reserved for heads of state and fallen heroes, Colonel Richard Thorne raised his hand in a salute. It wasn't a salute to a subordinate. It was a salute to a superior. Elias stood frozen, his eyes, usually so old and tired, filled with a sudden, glassy sheen. He straightened his own spine, fighting the urge to look away, and accepted the honor. "Thank you," Thorne said, lowering his hand. He turned to Leo, who was watching with his mouth slightly open. "Grab your bag, son. Not going to Fort Benning." Leo blinked. "Where are we going?" Thorne looked at Elias, then back at the violin. A faint, tired smile touched the corners of his mouth. The first real smile Leo had seen since his mother died. "Home," Thorne said. "We're going home. And I think we're going to need a music teacher." 1 year later. The autumn leaves in the park were a riot of gold and crimson, drifting down to cover the walking paths in a soft, crunchy carpet. The air was crisp, smelling of wood smoke and impending winter. On a weathered wooden bench near the duck pond, 2 men sat side by side. One wore a crisp military coat, his posture relaxed but attentive. The other wore a simple wool jacket, a scarf wrapped loosely around his neck to cover the scars that ran down to his collarbone. They weren't talking. They didn't need to. Standing on the grass in front of them, 15-year-old Leo Thorne was playing. He wasn't playing a cigar box anymore. He was holding a cello, a rich, deep-voiced instrument that rested between his knees. His eyes were closed, his head swaying slightly with the rhythm. The music was a Bach suite, complex and mathematical, yet Leo played it with a fluidity that made the notes sound like water flowing over stones. Passers-by slowed down to listen. A young couple stopped pushing their stroller. A jogger paused, pulling out an earbud. The music seemed to create a gravity well, pulling the frantic energy of the city into a moment of perfect stillness. Colonel Thorne watched his son. He watched the way Leo's fingers moved with confidence, the way his face held a look of intense, peaceful concentration. The ghost of the boy who had been afraid to speak was gone, replaced by a young man who had found a language that couldn't be silenced. Thorne felt a nudge on his arm. He looked over. Elias was holding out a paper bag of roasted chestnuts, his eyes crinkling in a silent offer. Thorne took one, cracking the warm shell. "He's getting better," Thorne murmured. "The vibrato is cleaner." Elias nodded. He gestured with a tilt of his head toward the cello, then tapped his own chest. "Heart." "Yes," Thorne agreed, looking back at his son. "He plays with heart." The song ended on a low, resonant chord that seemed to hang in the autumn air forever. Leo opened his eyes, looking first at Elias, then at his father. He smiled, a genuine, easy grin that lit up his face. "How was that?" Leo asked. Thorne didn't offer a critique. He didn't talk about discipline or technique or improvement. He simply leaned back on the bench, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the silent soldier who had saved his family twice. "It was perfect, Leo," Thorne said softly. It sounded exactly like the truth. And as the wind picked up, scattering the leaves around them, the three of them sat together in the golden light, listening to the music of a world that had finally learned to heal. We often judge a book by its cover, or a man by the scars on his face. But as Colonel Thorne learned, sometimes the quietest people carry the loudest love. I want to ask you something personal today. Have you ever known an Elias in your own life? Someone who was overlooked or underestimated by the world, but who turned out to have a heart of gold? Maybe it was a teacher, a neighbor, or even a stranger who showed you kindness when you needed it most. Please share their story in the comments below. Let's use this space to honor the silent heroes who usually go unnoticed. I read every single memory you share, and if this story touched your heart, if you believe that compassion is stronger than pride, then welcome home. Click that subscribe button to join our family. We have many more stories to tell. In fact, there is one waiting for you on the screen right now. It's about a promise made in the snow that took a lifetime to keep. Click it, and let's take that journey together.